humanities people. So it's nice to be able to be back in this room. My name's Hal Roth. I direct the Contemplative Studies program here at Brown. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our program to tell you a little bit about what we do. We look at contemplative experience across cultures and across time from scientific, humanistic, and artistic approaches. And we've developed critical first-person methods of studying contemplative practices. So we actually teach contemplative practices in the classroom. We teach what the practice is. We teach the cognitive framework in which that practice is embedded. But unlike what might happen in a contemplative practice center, we don't expect, we don't ask, we don't tell people to believe in the veridicality of that cognitive framework. We also temper that with third-person information from scientific sources and from humanistic research and scholarship on the culture and philosophy and history of those contemplative practice traditions. We have a very active program. We have an undergraduate concentration. We have a very active series of lectures. And we will have other events. If you'd like to learn more about what we have done in the past, we have videos. If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we're doing right now, please go to our website. And at the website, you'll see lots of information about us. We will have an open house coming up during, we haven't decided exactly which day, but it will be during the week that you're signing up for classes for second semester, which is about around October 20th. When Banner opens its secret doorway to the mysteries of registration. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Professor Charles Hallisey. He is the Numata Senior Lecturer in Buddhism at Harvard Divinity School. He did his undergraduate work at Colgate, did graduate work at Harvard Div School, at University of Chicago, where he received his PhD. He's become one of the leading scholars in this country of the Theravada Buddhist tradition. And I want to commend to you this wonderful translation of the poems of the first Buddhist women that came out a couple of years ago, published by Harvard in their particular publication series devoted to classics from South Asia. It's only available in hardcover in North America, but if you go to India, you can find it in train stations, apparently. And in not only in train stations, but in bookstores, and maybe even in grocery stores. So it's a real honor to be able to ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Charles Hallisey.
So first, let me welcome or thank everyone for coming on what is actually a very beautiful day, and when it was hard to leave the outside and then also hard to come inside. I also want to thank Hal Roth for inviting me to speak about Buddhist poetry within the framework of contemplative studies and not within the framework of either religious studies or comparative literature, but instead to say, somehow paying attention to the practices of poetry that Buddhists have developed over the years is relevant for how we think about not only Buddhism, but how we think about the contemplative studies and the study of contemplation as well. For me, I didn't know that this talk would be in this biomedical building, but in some ways it's really quite fortuitous, perhaps. You'll see later on I refer to one of the great theorists of literature from South Asia, a man named Dundon, who lived in around the 7th century. His book is extremely important across Asia. It's known in Tibet, China, as far as Japan, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and across South Asia as well. At one point he says, scientists make descriptions of the world, of nature, and so do we in poetry. What's the difference? And so he is theorizing that, oh, what might go on in a scientist describing the world is legitimate and proper, but there is a key difference that I'll introduce later. So to say, oh, in a building in which people are used to scientific descriptions of the world, it seems appropriate in Dundan's spirit that a lecture on poetry should occur here. What I wanted to try to do, taking seriously that this is part of the Contemplative Studies Initiative, this lecture, is to see poetry in the framework of the history of the Buddhist practices of mental cultivation, of meditation and so on, rather than part of the literary history of the Buddhist world in particular languages, or rather as part of Buddhist doctrinal history. The general point that I'm going to make is I want to suggest that literature in general, and poetry in particular, have a constitutive relation, some kind of key affinity to what we call Buddhism. So by paying attention to poetry as something of a contemplative practice, we will learn something about both Buddhism and about contemplation. That's the general point. Now, in the great epic of India, the Mahabharata, there's a narrative device that when people are traveling in the forest, they know that they're coming close to a place where Brahmins live because they can hear, before they can see them, Brahmins reciting the Vedas, what's called stepwise and word-wise, certain ways of memorizing. That little detail is a sign of a larger world. When you hear the Brahmins chanting, you know you're coming close to a place of Hindu practice. In Buddhist narrative literature, a similar device is there. People traveling through the forest, when they start to see the instruments used for writing, styluses for making manuscripts, book stands, other things that are bookcases, other things that are associated with writing, that they know they're coming to a place where Buddhist monks are. There's a place in which we say that small detail of the physical evidence of using writing actually tells us a lot about the history of Buddhism. One of the things that it shows, we know in the history of South Asia, the people who were using writing first were merchants for accounting and so on. It shows that the origins of Buddhism are very close to this kind of economic world where people are crossing cultural boundaries and using the technology of writing for a variety of purposes. It also teaches us a lot about how Buddhists thought about textuality, that they saw their text that they were receiving from the past as something that was something of a physical object that they could interact with and hand on to other people. But most interesting for me is the way that Buddhists began to use the kind of imagery of writing for understanding other kinds of practices. So when they asked, what did it mean when the Buddha said that he could remember his previous lives? What was he doing? Did he remember what he had for lunch every single day in all those previous lives? And what they compared the book to was the way that someone is a speed reader of a book. They're not looking at every word, they're not looking at every letter, they're skimming the pages and jumping over things in which they see only the essential bits. The ability to use that analogy shows a deep comfort with what writing represents, the way that it interacts with our minds and allows us to access information that, say, the recitation of a text would never allow for. The recitation of a text, it has to be that you go word by word. That they could use, that the imagery, the Buddha remembered previous lives, the way a speed reader skims over the page shows that they are very, very comfortable with what writing represents. And then for me, one of the most beautiful images of monks studying, and I just had to explain that in lots of the alphabets used in the Theravada Buddhist world of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, the scripts that are used are very curvy, they're rounded. There's a technical or practical reason for this. You're writing on palm leaves that if you had straight lines, the manuscripts would crack. The stylus would cut through the leaves. By making it curvy, you in some ways are preserving the leaves. But they are very round. And then it said, oh, what monks look like when they're studying, they look like a Garuda attacking a Naga. And a Naga looks like a snake, and a Garuda, we could say, looks like an eagle. And they are natural enemies. the image of the monks that they're hunched over with their arms spread out, facing down, and they're looking for a place in the text to attack, to pull out the point, is an image of, what we could say, an active reader. Someone who is looking for key, and the phrase that they use technically is for the knots in the text that you have to jump on and to pull out. I want to make a similar kind of claim that there's other things that don't actually occur in narratives, but would be just as symbolic of the presence of a whole Buddhist world as these instruments of writing are in Buddhist narrative. For American Buddhists today, when they meet someone who might be a Buddhist, they say, "Do you practice?" In Sri Lanka, when I lived there, if someone asked me, "Do you practice?" what they would be asking me would be, "Are you a good person?" It's very hard to answer. It's embarrassing to answer. I try. I don't succeed. I try again. I'm not sure. The language of American Buddhists, when someone says, "Do you practice?" they're asking, "Do you have a contemplative practice that you're doing?" And then if you say yes, they'll ask you, "What kind are you doing?" There's a way for American Buddhists today that the sign of a Buddhist world is some kind of contemplation technique. And one of the things is that when you go to Buddhist communities in Asia, you find out it's relatively unusual. My own teacher in Sri Lanka was a great scholar of Buddhist literature, widely admired as a good Buddhist, famous as a scholar. One time he was invited to meet a group of American academics to talk about Buddhism there. When he came back and I saw him, he was laughing, he said to me, all they wanted to talk about was meditation. And I haven't meditated since I was 7 years old. At that point, he was 65. And he said, and I only did it because I was made to go with my grandmother to the temple. And so the idea that to be a good Buddhist, you had to meditate was foreign to him. Because there's something, though, that there's an affinity between Buddhism and practices of mental cultivation, that we can't find any historical level or any place in Buddhist history where practices of mental cultivation are not there. They're just not essential. We can't say that wherever Buddhism is, everyone is writing. That's not true either. But I want to make a claim that just like with writing, just like with meditation, that poetry is part of what we could say the contours of a Buddhist life. And that we can't find any place in history or any geographical space that we can get to that poetry and literature is not part of Buddhist life. So we can't, the basic claim historically here is there's no place where we can point to, oh, Buddhism was there and then later on poetry or something was added on as an addition. Now, we also know is that throughout Buddhist history, great Buddhist thinkers are remembered as also being poets. Some of the greatest Buddhist thinkers are remembered that in addition to whatever else they did, they were excellent poets. Among the Dalai Lamas, the fifth Dalai Lama, who is generally referred to only as the Great Fifth, was an excellent poet. One of the greatest philosophers of Buddhism in South Asia, Dharmakirti, who was a logician, who worked on how do we establish what are the grounds for valid, that we know that we have valid knowledge from our perception. He was also a great poet. And that what we have is lots of poems attributed to him. Let me just read one short one that will illustrate something of his skill as a poet, but also the kind of the curiosity that such a careful logician, someone very difficult to read, also was very skilled in writing poetry. So it says, Valmiki, who was the author of the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, and in South Asia is remembered as the first poet. So Valmiki dammed the sea with rocks, put in place with monkeys. So this is part of the story of the Ramayana. An army of monkeys helps the god Rama and builds what we now call the Adam's Bridge between Sri Lanka and India. And the reminder says, oh, that natural phenomenon was built by this army helping Rama to go from India to Sri Lanka. So he says, Valmiki dammed the sea with rocks, put in place with monkeys, and Vyasa, the author of the other great Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, filled it with arrows shot by Partha. Yet neither is suspected of hyperbole. On the other hand, I weigh both word and sense, and yet the public sneers and scorns my work. O reputation, I salute you. Now, one of the things that we can learn from this is that Buddhist poets were comfortable being in a world with non-Buddhist poets. He saw himself in a lineage with the people who wrote the great Hindu epics. He knew about that in literature, people use hyperbole for a certain effect. I would translate it to say, well, why do people use hyperbole in poetry? We say false things to get at true things. We say exaggerated things so we can see what is there. Then that last line, oh reputation, I salute you. There's a name for this in Buddhist literary theory. It is blame through praise. He says, I salute you. We understand what he means is, I curse you. And even though he says, I salute you, he's saying, I curse you. This is one of the things that say, oh, Buddhists, other people thinking about how poetry and literature works, is how is it that we understand a meaning that is not said? And you could say, oh, this is a topic of watching the mind work. And we see the movements of mind, just like we see in contemplation, in which we start to change what we see, what we hear, into something else by watching how the mind is processing what is in front of us. Now, what we can say also is that in terms of what we have received through history, of what the Buddhists said, much of it is in verse and poetry. However, you say not very good poetry by later standards. Theorists of poetry, Buddhist theorists of poetry would say that, oh, that shows how good a poet he was because he made these mistakes. Because only a really skilled poet can make a mistake. Only a really skilled musician can play the wrong note and still create something beautiful. A hack can do something perfect, but only someone really good can make mistakes. But aside from that praise, we could say that's something of the element of literature where we have to see something that is not said, understand something that is not said, is key to the messages that are being transmitted. One of the most famous verses in Buddhist literature that echoes across the Buddhist world is that the religious life is divided into three parts. One part is about morality, another part is on meditation, and the third part is wisdom. There's a sequence. You have to practice morality, then you have to practice meditation, and then finally there'll be achievement of wisdom. That verse is the answer of the Buddha to a question that is put to him in a verse. Oftentimes the division into three is separated from the context. But the verse that is the origin of it is actually, I think, very, very moving. The story is that God comes to the Buddha in the middle of the night. And he says to him, there's a tangle inside, a tangle outside. Everyone is entangled by a tangle. I ask you, Gautama, who can untangle this tangle? Now, what's interesting, and Buddhist commentators on this verse understand that the Buddha understands when the God says to him, there's a tangle inside, there's a tangle outside, that he's not talking about some literal tangle. They explain, what is the tangle like? It's like a bamboo thicket, growing underground, growing above ground, all tangled up like a fence. So they say, oh, this is something metaphorical. They also realize that this God is not asking, what is that thing out there? It's a question of anguish in which he is asking, what's happening to me? He's coming to him, and when he says, there's a tangle inside, there's a tangle outside, everyone is entangled by a tangle. Who can untie it? It's a question of anguish. You might say it's like the rabbit in Alice in Wonderland that says, the hurrier I go, the behinder I get. I'm so behind. How can I catch up? Who can help me? And then they say, oh, this tangle is something that actually is jumping on him, possessing him. And when he says, they say, oh, when the Buddha hears him say there's a tangle inside, there's a tangle outside, the Buddha understands. He's asking, what's happening to me? I don't understand what's happening to me. And then he gives the answer. Anyone who is practicing morality, anyone who's practicing meditation, anyone who's practicing wisdom is untangling it. It's a very, very striking answer. He doesn't say, I can untangle it. He doesn't say, the person who finishes my religious life can untangle it. It's a present participle. Anyone doing this can do it. And the readers are just understanding. This is, to understand why the Buddha is speaking the way he is, you have to hear the despair, the desperation of this God who's coming to him saying, what's happening to me? And the way they get all of that out of it is just over, the Buddha understands that the word tangle is something that's actively happening to him. Now, in a kind of a curious way, what we saw about poetry in Dharmakirti's verse, where he started with Valmiki, all poets, Buddhist and non-Buddhist in South Asia, agree Valmiki is the first poet. Is not what we know historically. And there's a kind of interesting feature about the history of literature, the history of Buddhism in South Asia. Sanskrit is a language that is used in South Asia before Buddhism. It is a liturgical language. It's used in rituals. It is turned into a literary language, a language used for literature, for poetry, by Buddhists. They create it. So then this idea of Buddhism is at ground zero of the making of the history of literature in South Asia. And we could say literature is at ground zero of the making of Buddhism itself. And so this, we have a historical question. We can't see anything that, about literature that Buddhism doesn't seem to be close to. In terms of the great biography of the Buddha by Ashwagosha, the Buddhacharita, we have an explanation of why Buddhists are using poetry, which he says poetry is a vehicle for teaching. It's like mixing medicine into honey. It makes something bitter go down the throat. We take that explanation, which is there, we say, oh, what it really is a vehicle for doctrine. That's its purpose. When we look at the history of how Buddhists were creating Sanskrit as a literary language, a language for poetry, what we are paying attention to is a sociological process of how people who are outside of a social system are making a claim to be people of prestige, of having some kind of skills that other people could admire. We could say that what poetry creates is a possibility of Buddhism as being part of a civilization that is produced by elites, that creates prestige. So this helps us in a very important way, in which we could say that what literature is about is a skilled and difficult use of language that most people don't have the ability to do. And then you say, well, why are people using language in a literary way? It has to do with these sociological reasons. What I want to suggest to us this afternoon is that we should see literature and poetry as part of Buddhist mental culture, not as part of some kind of sociological process alone, not as a vehicle for transmitting doctrine that is otherwise known, but instead to see it as just one among the, we might say, almost innumerable techniques of mental culture that Buddhists across the centuries and across the cultures have been using. We know in meditation manuals that there are many techniques. So in the greatest one in Pali of the Theravada world, one by the 5th century Buddhist thinker Buddhaghosa, he names 41 different techniques of how to do meditation. What we also know, though, is that that list in that handbook is far from the sum total of what people were doing. And what we also know from the list is that some of those things were absorbed into the Buddhist practice from outside. That people saw it and said, oh, let's try that too, see what effects that it has. And that they were inventing new ones. And so new inventions of mental cultivation continue to this day, in which a skilled meditator is always a source of new knowledge and a source of new practices. And so the idea that there's a limited set of contemplative practices in Buddhism, we can just say it's just historically not correct. We have an idea, though, when we look at, say, non-Buddhist practices of mental cultivation being absorbed into Buddhism, and that they're accretions in some ways, something that comes in, that we have a sense of, oh, change in the Buddhist world comes from the outside. That's how the Buddhist tradition changes. It bumps into something else. It's in India, it bumps into China, and it gets changed. It bumps into things into that. And so change always comes from outside. When we actually look more closely at the history, we can see, people are inventing new things all of the time, and seeing things that are being done and say, we can use this as a mental, a practice of mental cultivation too. So we should say that the word that would probably be the most natural word for what we call meditation or contemplation in Buddhist vocabulary is bhavana, which would just be becoming. Anything that is, in our current idiom in universities, the Foucauldian idiom, anything that's a technology of the self, that is something that you do to change who you will be tomorrow, is within the category of bhavana. Now, what that means is that in English we would distinguish between meditation and ritual, two different kinds of things. In this world, not at all. Ritual is just another way of paying attention to what the body, the mind, and the mouth is doing. It is a way of focusing attention. It is a way of creating different kinds of perceptions. We can also say that the ubiquity, the centrally visible presence of the arts in the Buddhist world is connected to these practices of becoming. So that the practices of calligraphy, painting, the tea ceremony in Japan, and gardening are all techniques of mental cultivation. When you go to a Japanese temple and you see a sand garden with some rocks and some artificial moss-covered hills or lumps around the sand, and you are taught to look at it and see that what is in front of you, learn how to perceive that what's in front of you is not sand and rocks and moss, but ocean, mountains, and forests. What you see is that, looking at something that's not there, being attentive to how is it that I perceive what is in front of me, is that all of these practical actions of gardening, the tea ceremony, calligraphy, painting, all of these are part of a broad spectrum of the practices of contemplation, the practices of mental cultivation. What we could say is that what defines Buddhist practices of mental culture is anything that is conducive to a self-reflexive practice of seeing. Learning something about how is it that I see and then cognize the world. Then experimenting with what happens when I alter the habits of seeing. What do I learn? It's a very handy one that you can experiment for yourself. If you're right-handed and you sign your signature with your right hand, to try to sign your signature with your left hand. And what you realize is just how difficult the motions of the hand are to make when you change the habit of it. I don't know about anyone else. When I walk home from work, I walk exactly the same route. When I get to an intersection, I cross at exactly the same corner, and I don't see anything on the way home. I am lost in what I'm thinking. You say, if I vary the route, all of a sudden I start to have to notice kinds of things. And so these techniques of varying what you see by varying your habits, you can say it's a central practice, or a fundamental practice of practices of mental cultivation. We could say is that lots of mental cultivation in the Buddhist world has another element to it, another contour, that is somehow limiting the proliferating tendencies of thought. Somehow shutting off the ways that our mind starts to run with whatever is in front of us. We might say that in order to see, to deal with suffering, we need to understand the nature of perception. That our suffering comes from something about how we perceive things. And ways of understanding the nature of perception is what practices of mental cultivation are about. So the way we might begin, I think in terms of students here as part of the Contemplative Studies initiative of experimenting with different techniques of mental cultivation, is that you almost begin arbitrarily with any technique, and then you just watch what comes up in perception. And through your eyes, through your ears, the other senses, and the mind. And then you watch it without suppressing or indulging or expanding it. And you don't look for something to hang on to give it significance, or to be stuck in, or for anything fixed. Because the imperative is just see. But then the question is, what is not simply to see? What is not just see? You say, well, what is not seeing is to be indulged in or swamped by the underlying tendencies of proliferating thought. As they arise, the proliferating tendency of thought as it takes hold of our minds in the form of opinions, dogmas, beliefs, which we are just watching how thoughts come up. I like this, I don't like this. Now, what we can say is that it's within this space of the practices of mental cultivation that poetry in the Buddhist world takes its place, as well as being part of literary culture, as well as being part of religious culture. But it has a central place in the practices of mental cultivation. And here's where the figure I mentioned at the beginning, Dundon, comes in. Dundon's work, The Mirror of Poetry, say historically, the only thing that comes close to it in its cultural significance is Aristotle's Poetics. It has just jumped across language boundaries, cultural boundaries, religious boundaries, in which people were reading it, in which they said, we can use this too. One of the big insights of Dundon is what I referred to before. And he said, oh, in science people give factual descriptions, and in poetry we do too. What's the difference? And so he gave examples. In poetry, in literature, when I say poetry and literature, I'm using them almost interchangeably. Poetry is not verse, it's just a certain way of using language. He says, oh, there's 4 ways of making factual descriptions. First, he says, we're describing the kind of thing that is in front of us. And the example that he gives is where he says, oh, its feathers are green, its beak is red, it has a soft voice, it has stripes on its body, This is a pattern. Then he has another one where he says, oh, what we're paying attention to is not the type of thing that is there, but what we're actually seeing is something about the action, the movement of something in the world. And so then, sorry, just one second. He gives an example. He says, with a throat that produces soft cooing and eyes that keep rolling, the dove, eager for love, twirls around and kisses its mate. Now you can see something's coming into this that's really quite important. The difference between a scientific description and a description in literature is that twist. That when you see the dove rolling its eyes and turning, and the description, eager for a kiss, we can say, oh, doves don't kiss their mates. But if we're careful, we say, he doesn't say they kiss. He just say, eager for a kiss. And that there's something in what he's seeing that the scientific description doesn't see. The third, which I would say is my favorite, because it's so striking, he says, the hair in my body stands on end. My heart stops. My eyes shut. That's how it feels when my love touches me. Now that beginning, when he says, the hair in my body stands on end, my heart stops, my eyes shut, up to that point, it could be fright and horror. Then, when he says, you can translate what I put, that's how it feels when my love touches me. I can translate it. This must be my beloved. So when I look at the species of something, my beloved looks like everyone else. When I look at her moving, other people may move like her too. But what I know in my body about her, she's the only one that could do that to me. And you just say, I can't do that by my will. I can't make my hair stand on end. I can't make my heart stop. And what you have in this is that he's adding, oh, there's certain things, certain facts in the world that we know through what happens to us inside. The movements of mind, the processes of knowing. And you say, oh, we're very definitely in the realm of mental practices. Pay attention. I know something by species, I know something by actions, I know something by this other kind of quality. I know a quality that other people don't know. I'm assuming that many of you will have had the experience, I have, of trying to tell a friend about someone that you've fallen in love with, and they meet the friend and they say to you, I just can't see it. And one of the things that you'll say is, Dundon understands that. But what you see in your body is a fact. They can only see the species or the action, but not what is known through the body. The last type is particularly interesting. The example is mythological, but the general point is larger. Throat is black, skull in hand, the moon his crown, and a tawny touch on those matted locks. Shiva is here, with the bull on his banner. So describing the god Shiva is very standard in a certain way. You say, oh, what kind of description is this? You could say it's a description of something that is singular, singularity. How do we describe something that has no peer? And we say, oh, we need to have a description of those things that exist in the world that are singularities. In academic discourse today, singularity is a major concept. How do we know that? So in Buddhist contemplative techniques, people were interested in what is the singularity of certain beings. Now, so Dundon introduces into the world of poetry this idea that you can give a factual description that's somehow different than scientific description. And it's because of this certain twist that's in the perception, that sees something that is not there, and then wondering, how do we know that? And the exploration of, sometimes you change what you're paying attention to. You're looking at how it's a species, a kind of thing. You're looking at what is it at this moment in the action that it's capable of. You're looking at what you know as through the body. In relationship, you're looking at what makes this thing singular, without peer. He also adds something that other people understood really quite well, is that one of the definitions of literary language in South Asia is what it is crooked speech. It's not saying things directly. Dharmakirti, when he said, Valmiki got away with hyperbole, Vyasa in the Mahabharata got away with hyperbole, why won't people let me use hyperbole? And you say, oh, hyperbole is crooked speech. You're saying something that you know is not true to get at something that is true. And then you say, oh, this is a practice of looking at how language works and how we perceive the world, in which the language is not a mirror representing what's in the world, but it's actually creating something, a way of seeing what is in the world, so we can contemplate what that is. Done this example of hyperbole, the Dharmakirti felt charged. People have accused me of hyperbole. For me, it's a beautiful one. What it's describing is women who are going out to meet their beloved on a summer night. So they're dressed in white saris, white garments. They've woven white flowers into their hair. And because it's summer, they've put sandalwood paste on their faces that is pale, making them white. The twist is in the final line, in which he says, and when they step out into the moonlight, they disappear. That image, I've never seen that in the world, but my mind's eye can see it. This ability of the world to be bathed in moonlight, that things, individual things, disappear in some transformation that's there. So that, what you have is the extension of, well, what is perception about? And how does language not get it only in the way of perception, but to contemplate on how language actually creates certain possibilities that we don't want to give up what we know once we have seen that. Now, let me come to what I say will be an example of what I'm talking about. And it will be limited to just one verse from one medieval singular poem written by a particular Buddhist monk that I am more or less very confident that no one else in the room has heard of except for me, even though he is a great poet and was well known at his time. His name is Totagamoe Sri Rahula. He was what was known as Sangharaja, the king of the Sangha of his day. So he was the most important monk in the country of Sri Lanka at his time. And part of his prestige, his prominence was that he was a great poet. One of the poems that he wrote is what's known as a messenger poem. What these are is that they take as a model a poem by the great Sanskrit poet Kalidasa, who wrote a poem that's called the Meghaduta, or the Cloud Message. The premise of the poem is an unusual one. There's a certain kind of being, a yaksha, who's been sent into exile. And he asks the cloud to take a message to his wife and to tell her, I still love you, and I'm thinking of you. But he has to tell the cloud how to get there. So the whole poem really is about the instructions on how to get there. Go to the end of College Street, turn left. Go down Benefit Street, turn right. And so, and he said, how's the cloud going to know where he is? So he says, oh, when you see this, and he starts to just give factual descriptions of what is there. He said, you'll know you're there when you see this. One of the most striking things is that Kalidasa is very aware of what he's doing, in which the yaksha, the person sending the message, says at one point, what does a cloud have to do with a message? That how can a cloud take a message? All a cloud is some vapor and some fog, some noise, some lightning. And then he says, when you're desperate, try anything. But that image when he says, what does a cloud have to do with a message? It's just some vapor, some noise, some fog, some lightning. It's a pretty good description of what's coming out of our mouth when we speak. That air that's coming out is just some vapor. And that we are talking to each other, telling really important things through vapor, through noise, and something else that is happening there. So one of the striking things is that this very strange and very beautiful poem, it has touches that just are astounding. One of those kind of sweetest things for me is that the yaksha says, you know, when you get there, the first thing you should say is, I'm alive. And one of the things that you say, oh, in a pre-modern world where people would be away for years, there was no iPhones, no internet, no one knew if you were still alive, that what you want to know is the person I love still alive? And that kind of human touch is really a dramatic, factual description. That's what our world is. I'm worried. And he's saying, before I tell her that I'm thinking of her, and that tell her I'm alive, then he anticipates. How's she going to know that the message is from me? You could be making it up. So he says, all right, tell her this. And what happened is, he says, because he said, tell her, remember that time when you had that dream that I was flirting with someone else? And you woke up and you punched me and said, you louse. And you say, oh, how human this is, that things that we imagine, things that are in our dreams, bother us. But it was something that only the two of them could share. No one else was present. And this idea of the false thing, where she dreamed he was flirting with someone, revealed that she loved him, couldn't stand it, punched him, and that punch was a sign of her love for him. And they both laughed. Someone else punches me, I'll be really angry. But if my beloved punches me in a certain way, not every way, but a certain way, I'll be happy. Now this is Meghaduta, for whatever reasons, historical, because it's a great, great poem, became a model for a genre that we could say is the most important genre in South Asian poetry, by far. There are hundreds and hundreds of versions of someone asking an animal to take a message. They're still being written up into the 20th century. There's one right around the time of independence of India, where an untouchable, a Dalit, asked a bat, which is a very impure animal, it's in Telugu, so a leathery animal that is impure, to take a message to Nehru, the new Prime Minister of India, and say, we want to be part of a free India too. We want to be free too. And so that, what does a bat have to do with human freedom? But you say, oh, very powerful genre. There are about 200 versions of or instances of this genre in Buddhist Sri Lanka, in which the difference between Kalidasa's, where the directions are kind of imagined. The ones in Simile are all describing real places. They are historical documents. They're describing what something looked like at the time. And there's a kind of interesting thing. You can go there and say, oh, this is what it looks like. So the verse I want to read to you is something from the Selelihini Sandesha. What the Selelihini is in terms of biology, it could be either a starling or a grackle. Those two names sound worse than Selelihini. Selelihini sounds beautiful. Grackle sounds ugly. So Anglo-Saxon words with "ka" in them tend to have vulgar meanings to them. And so one of the things is say, oh, Selelihini sounds sweeter and nicer. What it is that the poet, and it's an interesting thing, this Buddhist monk has a sister who is a princess, and he wants her to become pregnant. But he's kind of prohibited as a monk from voicing those kinds of things out in public. But he still has this human yearning, and he asks this Selelihini, this grackle, to take a message to a god and say, let her conceive a child. That's the message. All of these messenger poems, the message is really dull and unimportant. It's the description of how to get there that's interesting. The verse I'm going to read you is a description of a place where a river meets the ocean. And it's also a place where a ferry is. So this is the description in which lots of times in Kalidasa's Meghaduta and all of these messenger poems, the person asking for the message to be carried says, make sure you notice this. You know, it's not only you'll know where you are, but take a while to enjoy it. It's like really pretty there, or something's happening. It would be a good place to rest. So what it says, and it's not a great translation, it's not so poetic but it will convey what's going on. Over the sheet of water, where the white kumadu flowers lie wrapped in moonlight all around, where fallen petals of red lotus float, from here, the Kotagamtora ferry take flight, with vigilance to reach the further shore. Now, these messenger poems in Sinhala are part of the high school curriculum today in Sri Lanka. It's like, at least when I was in high school, you had to read Julius Caesar in 9th grade, you had to read Hamlet in 10th grade, you had to read Macbeth in 11th grade, just Romeo and Juliet in 12th grade, and it was a recipe for hating Shakespeare. It took me decades to get over it. Right? So these are required works that people, in order to get into university, they had to pass an exam in what's known as A levels, advanced levels. So it would be like advanced placement in high school. I just want to share with you what a young Buddhist monk wrote to me last spring about his memories of reading this verse. I singled out this verse because of what he wrote to me, about what it meant to him. So he said, we were supposed to read the Selelihini Sandesha for our advanced level examination in 2007. I still cannot forget about the beauty of the poetry when it comes to where Totogamawe Sri Rahula describes some natural events and objects of nature, because I was always captivated by the way he was dealing with exaggerating them. I just want to emphasize before we go on, this is a very disciplined, serious monk who was remembering studying this poetry. And then he gives an extraordinarily interesting reading. This verse is an example that was where it was fascinating to me. This verse presents a very beautiful natural incident happening at night nearby the place called Kotagamtora. We know that it is naturally very beautiful to watch the sky being on the bank of a river, where the river meets the ocean, and the sky can directly be seen. So we have to see this with our mind's eye. It's a place where a river, fresh water, the ocean are meeting, and you're on the bank looking out into the ocean, and where you see the river, ocean, and sky all meet together. And it's a night sky. The river is dark, the ocean is dark, and the sky is dark. The boundaries between them are not so clear. Without any interruption created by, sorry, I should have gone on, where the sky can directly be seen without any interruption created by plants and animals. Just on the shore, there's nothing blocking the view. And you can spend some time there at night when the moon shines and flowers are blossoming. But the poet's description of this scene adds far more beauty to it. That particular flower, called kumadu, blossoms only at night. The simile, I'm not sure that the technical term simile is accurate here, but the vision is very important. The simile about the moonlight on flowers is fascinating here. Let me just go back to it. Over the sheet of water where the white kumadu flowers lie wrapped in moonlight all around. The simile about the moonlight on flowers is fascinating here. It is not said that the flowers are just getting moonlight. It is as if the flowers are putting on a blanket on them, covering themselves. So just to say, oh, what have you done here? The technical word is, it is a perceptual mistake in which he is attributing agency to the flowers, when plants don't have agency. The name is upreksha, seeing something wrongly, but seeing something accurately. And the image is that the flowers are not just being illuminated by the moonlight, they are wrapping themselves in white blankets. That's what the moonlight is. And then he goes on, it is as if the flowers are putting on a blanket on them, covering themselves. So the moonlight is compared to what they put on, the blanket. And the withered red tumbler of petals have dropped on the water, and they are sinking in the water. The petals are, of course, withered, but they are still colorful, and thousands of them on the surface of the water of the river is a very attractive sight to watch at night, when the whole area is being illuminated by moonlight. The gorgeous picture of this incident, drawn by my mind by this amazing description by the poet, I should say, could not be experienced, even having been to that exact place in person, but only by descriptions of this kind of peerlessly skilled poets. I just want to emphasize this kind of incredible action, or in reading, perception that he has, that the white flowers, their whiteness is they're wrapping themselves in a blanket, that they're not white because of the moonlight or the flowers, but something that they're doing that is connected to the moonlight itself. The red flowers that have fallen, that are floating, are also being illuminated by the moonlight. But if we visualize with our mind's eye, what we would start to see, those red petals floating in the water and disappearing underneath the surface probably will be indistinguishable between the reddish golden stars that are reflected in the water itself. So what we have in this is a constant interaction of what's out there and what is here, and we can't see the boundaries between things. And then to go further on it, poetry might encourage us to do, to start, and which this young Buddhist monk does not do, but to say it was ready at hand, we can interpret the different parts of the poem symbolically, in which we say that we know that the image of the moon is a standard conventional image of the Buddha's mind, the coolness of his mind, the purity of it, and then what you have is that the Buddha's gaze on the world, like moonlight, lights it up, and some people wrap themselves in garments, in actions that are reflecting something of the qualities of what he is like. Other things, the red petals that are floating, that are signs of our impermanence, are not appearing white, but they too are illuminated by this white light, this cooling light that is there. And then the interesting thing that you have of the last line of the poem, where the monk says to the Simile, to the Grackle, from here, take off, fly, just the way that the ferry does, with vigilance, to reach the further shore. And so in that image of, with these language, with vigilance, to reach the further shore, is this charged Buddhist language that what the religious life is about is reaching the furthest shore. It's happening on the shores of the ocean, where rivers, our lives flow into the ocean of samsara. And he says, don't be distracted by the beauty of it. It's there. Go on. And then that language of with vigilance that's there. Now, I just want to say that about the young monk, he's not a student of literature. He's remembering something that he learned in high school. He's a skilled contemplator. And there's a way in which that he is reading the poem in connection, recognizing. The poem creates a perception that is not possible to me with my physical eye, but my mind's eye sees, and I can't forget it. It's tied to language. That he says, oh, it's not only that language lights up the world, language creates things that I see in the world that I can't forget. And really kind of a striking kind of, when he was going through other things that, verses in the same poem that he remembered, a lot of them are highly erotic, in which he just said, oh, this is such a beautiful erotic scene. Which in one way, you say, is beyond the pale of what a monk should be talking about. But the literature allows him to talk about. Now, in that one verse, just emphasizing it, we say there's nothing about doctrine that is a guide to what it means. It is just an exercise in learning how to see what the language helps you to see, in which the world begins to look different, in which the world starts to shine with this moonlight and becomes extraordinarily beautiful. There's nothing in this verse about renouncing the world, being repulsed by the ugliness of the world that's filled with suffering. It is about a world that is determinately beautiful and waiting for us to appreciate what is there. We could say that if we say doctrine is not a guide, what is this? I say it's a very ordinary form of what we can use the distinction between spirituality and religion. Say it's a very ordinary form of Buddhist spirituality. In American English, we're quite used to hearing people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. What they mean by that, I have no truck with, I'm not interested in doctrines, institutions, this tradition. I just have certain feelings. When I speak to young people who read these messenger poems in high school, probably under terrible conditions for appreciation, they're just trying to pass exams. They've been struck again and again where they say, these poems give me a spiritual feeling. There's something about it that you could say is outside of Buddhist doctrine, outside of the mainstream of Buddhist religious culture, but some place where we might say that what we have is a kind of Buddhist spirituality that speaks against Buddhist religion, in which Buddhists themselves embrace both of them. They embrace a vision of the world in which they are repulsed by the suffering that is intrinsic in it, and they are intent on getting to the other shore, eventually. But they are also entranced by a world that is just so unbelievably beautiful. And that the danger is always to be held in front of it, fascinated by how the world is bathed in moonlight. And that's just the way that the Buddha's gaze looks on the world, adding beauty to what the world is about. With that, I'll stop. Thank you. I don't know what the practice is to have questions. Please.
I So I don't know if the premise of this question will reflect my own ignorance of Buddhist poetry more particularly, but as you see sort of Kavya develop in South Asia, one of the major trends is this move toward just playing with, like, what seems to be going on in the material you were looking at is these kinds of playing with imagery, but you see also this trend of playing with the language itself in things like Shlesha and things like Chitrakavya. And I know Hindu poets were very deeply invested in this, Jain poets were very deeply invested in this. I'm not aware of that kind of investment amongst Buddhist poets. So, my question is, am I just oblivious to a body of literature, or do you think that there's a reason for a different set of emphases?
It's not a different set of emphases.
Okay.
The emphases are the same. And it's not that you're oblivious to a body of literature. It's that people like me have been taught not to kind of share it with people, because you say Buddhism is not about that. Buddhism is about that all this is suffering. But Chitrakavya, all over the place. And Dundan gives a reason, where he says, this stuff is pretty hard, and not everyone likes it, but when good poets are together, it's fun to do. And so we entertain each other by showing them. And they really show off a lot. So for those of you who don't realize some of the things that they can do, so you can have a poem that if you read it forward, it tells the story of the Ramayana. If you read it backwards, it tells the story of the Mahabharata. And it's long. It's like really long. And you say, these are people who have way too much time on their hands. But you also just say, they're really good. Now, to put it within a Buddhist context, you say, why would they do that? Are they just imitating what other people are doing, secular poetry, Hindu poetry? You say, no, not at all. All this kind of control of language is a disciplined use of language, to see everything that is there. And if you say that what a monk, the ideal monk should be, is a Vinayadata, a supporter of the Vinaya, which means that he holds his body in a certain way. And Vinaya manuals are about which foot goes through the door first. How do you make your body kind of beautiful that other people feel is worthwhile giving gifts to? And when you're in the presence of someone, you're commanding. And it's really disconcerting when the monk is 10 years old. And you'd say, I'm 50 years older than you, and you're in charge. And just by that way, he holds his body. So you say, there's a discipline of the body. What we think of as meditation is a discipline of the mind. You say, but there's three kinds of actions: body, speech, mind. And literature is where there's a discipline of language, and both with meditation and with the body, to see what it produces. And it produces all sorts of things. And the Chitrakavya, is, not everyone likes it, but it is like good. The Chitra is a picture, so there's ways in which you can arrange a poem in the shape of a wheel, in the shape of a flag, all kinds of things. And then you read the letters in different ways. So that when you read it originally, you say, this makes no sense. When you put it into a picture, like very complicated messages start to come out. And it's really like pleasurable. You feel really good when you figure it out.
I'll want some recommendations from you then. And were they doing this was this in Sanskrit or was it in
Sinhala?
Okay.
In Sinhala. And the thing is that these things are very hard to translate. So there's one kind of picture, way of organizing a poem that's called cow's ear.
Yeah.
And so what it is that you're reading the letters in like zigzags. So you're not reading in a linear way, you're reading this letter, and this letter, this letter, this letter, this letter. And you say, unless you know how to do that, you can't read. And so,
thinking about the roles of meditation and words in Buddhism and then coming to realization, and how typically to be gaining wisdom one needs to decades of dedicated meditation practice. But then thinking like back to the Buddha's day, people would hear him give like one sermon and have this sudden awakening. So what do you, the power of like speech and words, and maybe the descriptions of that happening itself is hyperbole, but that power then as opposed to now, what do you think about?
Great question. In one way, it takes us into the Buddhist philosophy of language and what language does in the world. And this is a very complicated thing. What they say, they're very sophisticated. They're also very self-reflective, and sometimes they're fun. One of my favorite stories is there's a monk in a cave in southern Sri Lanka, and he's reciting a text, and he hears this voice that says, "Oh, monk, you say that very well." And then he stops. And it goes on, and here's the voice again. "Oh, monk, you say that very well." And then he says, "Who said that?" And then this little tree god says, "I do." And then the monk says to him, "How do you know how the Buddha said it?" And the tree god says, "I was there." Which is like one of the great dreams of Buddhist life, to kind of see the Buddha again. So he says, "You were there. What did he look like?" And he says, "Well, when the Buddha spoke, every god in the universe came to hear. He was in northern India, and I'm not such a big god, so I was at the back of the crowd. I was off the southern coast of Sri Lanka up to my neck in the water." So he said, "I couldn't see anything." So then the monk says to him, "Well, you were there. And when people heard the Buddha speak, they were enlightened. What happened to you?" And then the god says to him, "Well, monk, there's some questions that should not be asked." So one of the things that you would say, "Oh, I wasn't paying attention." But so one of the things that you have in this is that, yes, there's a certain kind of philosophy of language that comes to certain conclusions. There's another, you could say in the literature, there's another philosophy of language that comes to different conclusions. One is a question, can the language accurately represent what is there in reality? And they disagree. Some people say yes, some people say no. And you have this whole distinction between conventional truth, it's just what we use by convention, and the ultimate truth, ways of describing reality and what it is. Sometimes that's taken that the conventional truth is not really true. In the schools of the Theravada, they take seriously the statement that truth is one, there is no second. They're both true. And so then what you have is an idea that the world is kind of underdetermined in its appearances. And that the statements, the exaggerations, the hyperbole, all the things, the mistakes, the misperceptions that poetry rejoices, gets at something that is really there. And then the contemplation is, how is it that truth and falseness are right next to each other? Like the river and the ocean. That the river is a falseness of hyperbole and it flows into the ocean of truth and it gets lost in truth. So that it brings us to the truth. And so you say in the literary cultures, there's a different philosophy of religion than when we just look at kind of logic, that is, what are the valid means of perception. So in Buddhist studies, we don't want to know about the literary cultures. We just like the logicians and the philosophy of language.
I was struck. Oh, go ahead. Is that Hal? Oh, I'll go ahead. You then. I was really struck by the poem that one of them about tangles and how we're tangled in tangles and who can untangle me, and the use of repetition. And one of the things that struck me is, in my understanding, as Indian and Indic Buddhist literature is translated into Chinese and into East Asia, although there is repetition in literature before that, the Chinese begin to associate repetition with Buddhism or Buddhist something. And there's some way in which repeating words and then alluding to the slightly different meanings does something Buddhist for them. So So I'm wondering if, just out of ignorance, in terms of how repetition is used in poetics more generally, in non-Buddhist poetics, is there some way that Buddhists use these non-Buddhist things in Buddhist ways? If I could employ some repetition here.
Well, one thing is that, Buddhist scriptures, Buddhist texts, authoritative texts, lots of them are very, very repetitive. Academic explanation of this is that this is about the mechanism of how they were transmitted in the oral culture, which I don't believe. The whole thing about the writing instruments, I don't think that Buddhists were relying on oral recitation for the transmission of their texts. They were using things written down. And then when you look at Buddhist readers of those texts, they don't see the repetitions functionally. They see that each repetition has a different meaning in it. And then they are exploring how, like the changing we can do vocally, which we can change the meaning of the word by how we voice it. And that we could say the same word 3 times in a row, in which we could add some kind of intonation or something that a different meaning would come out. And then what you have is a really interesting question for readers. How do we return what is mute on the page of a manuscript of a book to speech? That it is what speech was. Then it's being preserved on this mute page. Then it has to be returned to speech. And that what they're doing in this is trying to see something that in the repetitions, it's something that's in speech itself. And so what's interesting is that, say, when Buddhist texts jump across linguistic boundaries from South Asia to China, in which the Chinese are getting just like a tsunami of stuff all at once, and they're from all kinds of different sources, and they're trying to make sense of it all. That one of the things that they picked up was the repetition is significant. And that somehow they learned that, and they were trying to, they didn't know how it was significant. They just said, let's not clean it up. And it's 3 times, says the same thing 3 times, let's not just say, that's just for ease of memorizing. He said it for 3 times. There's something in that. What can we say about that? But you're right, this is a feature of a lot of the texts, of what kind of repetition. And this is one of the things that people can play with. You can have a game in which 4 verses are written out of words that only have 3 syllables, the same 3 syllables that are used in different kinds of repetitive things, in which is that it's saying only one simple thing. You say, no. Actually, when it says that here, it means this. When it says it's here, it's a different meaning. And so then there's this gap between the vehicle of the word and the word itself, in which you say, the vehicle can be the same, but there's radically different words there. And there's a skill, again, of perception, in which you have to say, let me look at it again, and not hang on to what I first saw, and see what else is here. And you say, well, that's like part of literary culture of showing off.
What you were saying about the contrast between kind of a scientific description and a poetic or literary description calls to mind a number of kind of parallel structures in the worlds that I inhabit. The contrast between descriptive language and evocative language. The contrast between a kind of third person, we're looking at something from the outside and, as opposed and trying to describe it, as opposed to a first person where you're inhabiting an experience and trying to communicate that experience and evoke a sympathetic resonance or an appreciation of that in the subjective experience of the listener. And there's a range of possible ways that you can express subjective experience, some of which is so subjective it evokes nothing in other people, and some of which is so wonderfully suggestive of their own experience, that it evokes a recognition in the listener. And the parallel to me is actually comes out also in Rinzai Zen practice with the use of koan. There's a way in which if you approach a koan as a description of something, like does the dog have a Buddha nature? No. Or what is the sound of one hand clapping? If you look at it from the outside in as descriptive, you can never really unpack it. You can never really manifest it. You can't really realize what it's about. But if you look at it as evocative of something and find what that experience is in your own experience, that's how you connect. That's how you can realize it. That's how you can get to the core of it.
I would say that my understanding of what's going on here is different. And so the way I would make the contrast is that we may be approaching poetry in particular as somehow being an expressive practice.
What I'm suggesting here is that it's not an expressive practice, it's a contemplative practice. It's trying to guide people to have a perception of things that they don't ordinarily have. So it's not connecting automatically to an experience you've already had. It's giving you an experience you haven't had, in which you say, I can see that. And then they're saying, think about how you can. And so some of it is, say in the Cloud Messenger, the Kalidasa's Megadutta, is a very standard kind of thing that, or it becomes standard. What it is that the Yaksha who is speaking to the cloud, and he says, you are such a big cloud. You're so firm, so dark. When you're zooming across the air, the women who are working in the fields, the Siddha women, will look up and they'll think that the top of a mountain has been blown off and is being blown through the air. So this is about a misperception. But you immediately can see what the cloud looks like. It's sharp angled, and then it's not that, oh, I've seen clouds like that. I've never seen a cloud like that. And what you can do is, say with the grackle, the Selali, what the poet does, he says to the bird, you gotta be careful when you're flying over those women in the field, because they're gonna look up and they're gonna see just how rosy your legs look. They're going to think that it's Carl, and they're going to try to grab you and put you on, that makes you into earrings. So just make sure you stay up. All right? Now, this is a very complicated thing, because, again, it's based on, oh, I see something by misperception. The poet is saying, it looks like a mountaintop. You say, well, that's what that cloud looks like. And you say, well, how can I see something that I've never seen? And then the other is, how can I see a cloud that looks like a mountaintop? I say, yeah, my mind's eye can see that. Then when the Simile poet says, and those Siddha women are in the fields and they look up and they see you, and they see your legs and how red they are, they're going to try to grab you, so make sure you stay up. What comes into my mind is Kalidasa, in which I say, oh, this is Kalidasa. He knows Kalidasa. I could say it's an illusion. You know, David Shulman and Yuval Brona have given the name. It's intensifying. It's making the singular poem denser, because everything I know about Kalidasa and almost every Sandesha poem that I read has a moment in which the messenger is misperceived, and always by the Siddha women. And then you just say, oh, what I remember from Megadutta, from Kalidasa, now is in the Simile. And you say, how did that happen? And you can say, that's not out of my experience. It's an experience that only exists in poetry. And there's a certain pleasure to say, oh, that was so nice, that kind of illusion there. We just say, I think this is like elegant and beautiful, and also not limited to these literary cultures. So here's an example. My sons were university, long car rides with them. And they would try to educate me on the music that they listened to, which I hate. we're trapped in the car, and then I would say that's trash. I said, no, listen. And so there was a song by the Wu-Tang Clan called I Can't Sleep at Night. Some of you know it, others don't. Here's the basic thing. Some guy's wailing about how horrible it is to be African American in the United States. All the things that happen, he says, I can't sleep at night. So we listen to a certain point, and then my son says to me, right, listen to what he called the beat. So listen to the rhythm. So you can do that with your mind, you only listen to one thing. He said, all right, you got it. And now technology means on his computer he has, I don't know, 15,000 songs that he's illegally downloaded. I don't want to know about. And he has all these covers of different songs. And he starts to play me a song that I know, Dionne Warwick, Walk On By. And so about a breakup, a woman saying to him, man, if you see me on the street, don't stop and talk to me, just walk on by, because I'll start crying. And the beat is the same. And then he plays me the cover by Isaac Hayes, in which it changes everything when a man's singing to someone else than a woman singing. It's very distinctive. He's like, oh, okay. Then he goes back to the original Wu-Tang Clan, Ghostface Killer singing. And we go on, and at a certain point, just listening to it, and all of a sudden, Isaac Hayes comes in, starts singing, which you immediately know, this is Isaac Hayes. And he goes, stop your crying, be a man. And you think, wow. And this other song, in all those covers of Dionne Warwick, Isaac Hayes, enters into this song. They're all present. And I say, oh, that's an object of contemplation. How did that happen? And it depends on knowing stuff, and you say, God, this is a lot more complicated than I ever thought. I just thought it was strange, I couldn't hear it. And then, when listening to it, this technology has made it possible for people to listen to things that, when I was their age, it was impossible. You could never buy so many records. And you say, well, the technology is connected to the contemplation. And it creates different possibilities. And poetry is the same kind of thing. Depending on the connoisseurs who know stuff, and they say, oh, that's nice. You recognize that? That's the beat from Megadoo.